Working the night shift as a watchman at the cemetery was a lonely and eerie job, especially on Halloween night. My role was simple: make sure no one entered the cemetery after hours, deter vandals, and keep an eye on the grounds. But this particular Halloween night, the tranquility of the graveyard was shattered, and the events that unfolded still haunt my memories to this day. The cemetery stretched out beneath a starlit sky, tombstones and mausoleums looming like silent sentinels in the moonlight. I had brought a thermos of hot coffee and a stack of books to keep me company, expecting a quiet night. The air was cold and crisp, and the occasional gust of wind rustled the leaves, creating a haunting symphony of sounds. As I sat in my small watchman's shack, sipping coffee and reading by the dim glow of my desk lamp, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The atmosphere seemed charged with an eerie energy, and the stories my grandmother used to tell me about restless spirits and Halloween night came to mind. I brushed off the superstitions, reminding myself that the most action I'd ever seen on this job was the occasional group of rowdy teenagers trying to sneak in. But as the night wore on, the sense of unease deepened. I began to hear strange noises, a soft, mournful wailing like distant cries of grief. I stepped out of the shack to investigate, my flashlight in hand, but the source of the sound remained elusive. The cemetery seemed different in the moonlight, as if the tombstones had rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the nagging feeling that I was not alone lingered. A heavy fog rolled in, obscuring my vision and casting an eerie pallor over the graveyard. I could barely see the nearest row of tombstones, and the night felt unusually dark and foreboding. I returned to the shack, locking the door behind me and taking a swig of my now lukewarm coffee. As I continued to read, the cries outside grew louder, more desperate. I knew I had to investigate once more, my duty as a watchman demanding that I ensure the cemetery's security. I ventured outside, my flashlight cutting through the thick fog. The cries seemed to be coming from a nearby mausoleum. As I approached, the heavy door creaked open, revealing a dark chamber within. The cries emanated from the darkness, echoing off the stone walls. Fear gripped me, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone was in distress. I stepped inside, the air growing colder with each passing moment. My flashlight revealed a chamber adorned with ancient urns and marble statues, their solemn expressions casting eerie shadows on the walls. The wailing grew louder, and I could now discern words, an anguished plea for release from a terrible suffering. My heart raced as I realized I was not alone. A figure clad in tattered rags appeared before me, its face contorted in torment. It reached out with bony fingers, its eyes filled with despair. I stumbled backward in horror, the figure's cries growing louder and more desperate. It spoke of curses, dark rituals, and a terrible fate that had bound it to the mausoleum. The air was thick with malevolence, and I could feel the presence of otherworldly forces. Desperation overcame me, and I fled the mausoleum, slamming the door shut behind me. The cries grew fainter, and the eerie fog seemed to dissipate. But the night was far from over, and the events that unfolded were more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. As I returned to my shack, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The night seemed to grow colder, and the distant wailing continued, now joined by otherworldly whispers that seemed to echo from the very tombstones themselves. I glanced out the window, and my blood turned to ice. The cemetery was no longer empty. Figures clad in tattered rags roamed the graveyard, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. They moved with a slow, deliberate gait, their spectral forms casting unsettling shadows. I could hear their whispers, their voices a cacophony of torment and despair. They spoke of suffering and eternal imprisonment, of a curse that had bound them to the cemetery. Panic set in as I realized I was surrounded by the restless spirits of the dead. I frantically called the police, my voice trembling as I tried to explain the supernatural horrors unfolding before me. They assured me that an officer was on the way, but the whispers and wails of the spirits grew louder, their spectral figures drawing closer to the shack. The air grew heavy with malevolence, and the very walls of the shack seemed to close in on me. I could feel the spirits' icy touch, their bony fingers reaching out for me. Desperation overcame me as I huddled in a corner, my flashlight flickering. The police arrived just in time, their presence dispelling the otherworldly forces that had terrorized me throughout the night. They searched the cemetery but found no trace of the figures I had described. To this day, I can't explain what happened that Halloween night at the cemetery. I've since quit my job as a watchman, and I avoid that graveyard after dark. The experience remains a chilling enigma, a reminder that there are mysteries in this world that defy explanation, and that on Halloween night the boundary between the living and the dead can blur in the most terrifying ways imaginable. Working the night shift at the local convenience store on Halloween night wasn't exactly how I had envisioned spending the holiday. But as a struggling college student, I couldn't afford to turn down the extra hours. The evening began like any other, but little did I know that it would become a chilling tale of horror and survival that still haunts my every thought. As I took my place behind the counter, the store was bathed in the flickering fluorescent glow of harsh white lights. The eerie silence of the empty store was only occasionally interrupted by the hum of the refrigerators and the faint hum of the store's radio playing classic rock. The minutes dragged on, and the minutes ticked away slowly, reminding me that I was missing out on the Halloween festivities outside. A couple of hours passed, and I had grown accustomed to the routine. I scanned items, restocked shelves, and tried to stay awake. But as the clock neared midnight, the atmosphere inside the store began to change. The familiar flicker of the overhead lights signaled an approaching power outage, and the store plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and began to make my way toward the front door, hoping to alert any customers who might still be in the store. As I reached the entrance, I found the door ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. My heart quickened, and I stepped outside to investigate. The street outside was empty, and an eerie stillness hung in the air. The moon cast long, unsettling shadows, and the distant hum of the town had disappeared, leaving only the chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind. A sense of unease washed over me, and I pushed the door closed. But as I turned to go back inside, a chilling sight stopped me in my tracks. A figure, cloaked in tattered rags, stood at the edge of the parking lot, illuminated by the feeble light of the emergency exit sign. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I called out, "Can I help you?" My voice wavered, barely audible over the night silence. The figure remained motionless, its head tilted slightly to the side. I took a cautious step toward it, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure finally moved, taking a step toward me. I could see the moonlight glinting off a pale, distorted face beneath the hood. It was a face that seemed to be trapped in perpetual anguish, its eyes dark and hollow. The figure raised a skeletal hand toward me, its fingers long and gnarled. Panicking, I rushed back into the store, locking the door behind me. The fluorescent lights flickered back to life, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I told myself it must have been a trick of the darkness, a Halloween prank played by some local kids. Just as I was about to call the police, the phone line went dead. The sense of unease returned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I decided to remain vigilant, keeping an eye on the security cameras as I continued my work. As the hours passed, I became increasingly aware of strange occurrences within the store. The shelves seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking, and items would disappear, only to reappear in unexpected places. I could hear faint whispers in the aisles, barely audible but unmistakably present. The radio, which had been playing classic rock, began to emit a series of distorted, otherworldly sounds. The voices grew louder, their words incomprehensible. Panic welled up inside me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something unseen lurked in the shadows of the store. I turned off the radio and reached for my flashlight, determined to investigate. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered again, plunging the store into momentary darkness. In the dim light of my flashlight, I saw them, twisted, ghostly figures, clad in rags, their faces twisted in agony. They shuffled closer, their fingers reaching out, and I realized with terror that these were the same figures I had seen outside the store. Their hollow eyes bore into me, and their whispers grew louder, a cacophony of torment and despair. I ran for the front door, my heart pounding in my chest, but as I reached it, I found the door locked from the outside. I was trapped with these spectral apparitions, and there was no escape. The figures closed in, their bony fingers grasping at my clothes, their voices echoing in my ears. Desperation overcame me, and I lunged for the fire extinguisher, smashing a window to escape the store. Glass shattered, and I scrambled out onto the dark street, leaving the nightmarish figures behind. As I ran, I could still hear their wailing cries and whispered pleas, tormenting me even in the cool night air. I made it to the nearby police station, gasping for breath and covered in glass shards. I reported what had happened, but the officers who arrived at the scene found no evidence of the figures or the strange occurrences in the store. To this day, I can't explain what happened that Halloween night. I've quit my job at the convenience store, and I avoid walking past it after dark. The experience remains a haunting enigma, a chilling reminder that some horrors are beyond the realm of explanation, and that on Halloween night, the boundary between the living and the supernatural can blur in the most terrifying ways imaginable. Working at the local haunted house was an annual tradition in our small town. It had always been a spooky but fun way to spend Halloween night, and the experience of scaring the visitors and hearing their screams had brought our group of friends closer each year. However, on that fateful Halloween night, things took a chilling turn that none of us could have anticipated. The haunted house, situated in an abandoned, centuries-old mansion, was legendary in our town. Its dilapidated exterior loomed in the darkness, with crooked shutters and vines that seemed to strangle its decaying walls. Every year, a group of us would gather there, donning our scariest costumes and makeup, ready to terrify the brave souls who dared to enter. This particular Halloween night was no different as we assembled in the dimly lit entry hall, excitedly discussing our roles and strategies. The air was heavy with anticipation, and our costumes had been meticulously designed to elicit fear from the guests. I, along with a few others, was assigned to play a deranged asylum patient, a character that I had embraced with wild hair, smudged makeup, and a straitjacket that bound me in a twisted, uncomfortable embrace. The night began like any other, with groups of visitors cautiously entering the mansion, led by a guide who would take them on a winding tour through the haunted halls. My friends and I lurked in dark corners and hidden alcoves, waiting for the perfect moments to jump out and unleash our best scares. But as the night wore on, a feeling of unease began to creep over us. It started with whispers, indistinct, distant murmurs that seemed to come from the very walls of the mansion. We dismissed them as the product of an overactive imagination, chalking it up to the spooky atmosphere and the adrenaline of the night. As I hid in my assigned spot, waiting for the next group of visitors to pass, I noticed something odd. The hallway I was in seemed to shift and warp, the walls closing in on me as if the very architecture of the mansion were alive. I struggled to breathe, my straitjacket tightening around me, constricting my movements. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't free myself. My friends jumped out at the group that passed by, screams and laughter echoing through the mansion. But as I struggled to break free from the straitjacket, a sense of isolation settled in. The distant whispers grew louder, their words now distinct. They spoke of madness, confinement, and unspeakable horrors. I managed to slip one arm free from the straitjacket, but the walls of the hallway continued to close in, and the whispers in my ears grew louder. The very air seemed to vibrate with malevolent energy. I called out to my friends, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Desperation overcame me, and I tore at the straitjacket, my movements frantic and wild. With a final wrenching effort, I managed to free myself and stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. But the mansion had changed. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the ceiling seemed to be festooned with cobwebs. I could hear the distant cries of anguish and torment. I raced through the mansion, desperately searching for my friends, but each room I entered was more disturbing than the last. I found myself in a twisted funhouse of horrors, with grotesque figures and nightmarish scenes that defied explanation. The whispers in my ears grew louder, and I could feel unseen eyes upon me. As I reached the mansion's decrepit ballroom, I encountered my friends, huddled together in a corner, their faces contorted in terror. They told me they had experienced similar nightmarish visions, and the whispers had grown into relentless pleas for release. We made a desperate dash for the mansion's exit, but it seemed to move further away with each step, the walls shifting and warping around us. We were trapped in a nightmarish labyrinth, with no way out. As the mansion's horrors closed in on us, we could hear the anguished cries of those who had once inhabited the mansion, their restless spirits tormenting us. The very walls seemed to pulse with malevolence, and we were drowning in a sea of despair. With a final surge of terror, we burst through the mansion's front doors, collapsing onto the dark, rainy night. The mansion itself seemed to scream in agony, its twisted facade contorted in a grotesque grimace. We stumbled away from the haunted house, our hearts pounding and our minds reeling from the horrors we had witnessed. We never returned to that place, and we never spoke of the nightmarish ordeal we had endured. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that haunted house on Halloween night. I can only say that some terrors are beyond the realm of explanation, and that on that fateful night, the line between the living and the dead blurred in the most horrifying and inexplicable way imaginable. We made a desperate dash for the mansion's exit, but it seemed to move further away with each step, the walls shifting and warping around us. We were trapped in a nightmarish labyrinth with no way out, As the mansion's horrors closed in on us, we could hear the anguished cries of those who had once inhabited the mansion, their restless spirits tormenting us. The very walls seemed to pulse with malevolence, and we were drowning in a sea of despair. With a final surge of terror, we burst through the mansion's front doors, collapsing onto the dark, rainy night. The mansion itself seemed to scream in agony, its twisted facade contorted in a grotesque grimace. We stumbled away from the haunted house, our hearts pounding and our minds reeling from the horrors we had witnessed. We never returned to that place, and we never spoke of the nightmarish ordeal we had endured. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that haunted house on Halloween night. I can only say that some terrors are beyond the realm of explanation, and that on that fateful night, the line between the living and the dead blurred in the most horrifying and inexplicable way imaginable. Thanks for watching. Don't miss out on more spine-chilling tales. Subscribe now for weekly scares. Hit that red button and join our journey into the unknown.